Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 16th ReCap webinar. Today's webinar is entitled Upheaval and Implosion Towards a Philosophy or History of the Present. Our speaker is Michael Marder, the Basque Research Professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of the Basque Country. Michael's writings spans the fields of ecological theory, phenomenology, and political thought. He is the author of numerous scientific articles and 18 monographs, including Plant Thinking, Phenomena Critic, Logos, The Philosopher Plant, Dust, Energy Dreams, Heidegger, Political Categories, Pyropolitics, Dumb Philosophy, Hegel's Energy, Green Mass, Senses of Upheaval, Philosophical Snapshots of a Decade, and A Philosophy for Passengers. We live a time of great upheavals. Every sphere of existence is now home to the destabilizing forces that are remolding the environment, redrawing social boundaries, shaking up the economy and family relations, altering individual psychologies and political orders. Michael's contention is that the world is largely changing through upheavals whose effects lead to what he defines the implosion of history. In this talk, Michael will tell us about the tensions and interplays of upheavals and implosion with respect to the war waged by Putin's regime in Ukraine. His analysis may prove useful for elaborating a robust philosophy of history in the 21st century. Without further ado, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Claudio, for this introduction. It's a pleasure to contribute to the webinar. As you mentioned, the title of my talk is Upheaval and Implosion Toward the Philosophy of History of the Present. And it's not a very contentious point to say, as you mentioned, that we live at a time of great upheavals. That means that catastrophe and global devastation no longer refer to fantastic scenarios of a dystopian future. They really knock on our doors. And they are right here. They are molding and defining our reality in all of these different spheres. So how can we interpret the world in a state of upheaval, a world that seems to elude our capacities for understanding reality more swiftly and more deftly than ever before? As we all know, Marx wrote in his 11th thesis on Feuerbach that, I quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." But a rejoinder to Marx may be that the point now, in the 21st century, is to interpret a changing world, and that in any case, without a careful and indefatigable interpretation, it is impossible to ascertain if and how the world is changing. My contention is that the world is largely changing through upheavals that, experienced from within, cause it to lose its quality of worldliness, its livable, habitable character. So we live in a world in upheaval that is constantly changing through upheaval and that ceases to be familiar and habitable to us. Combined, the effects of such upheavals lead to what I call the implosion of history. And as I mentioned to Claudio just a moment ago, I'm really looking forward, specifically in our discussion, to thinking perhaps a little bit more in depth the relation between upheaval and implosion, these two poles that are molding today's reality. We tend to treat upheavals as more or less synonymous with revolutions, mayhem, disorder, disarray. Still, there is something highly idiomatic about this word and the process it designates, something that will help shed light, however unsteady, on what is going on at present. Upheaval literally means the heaving up of the earth. The English verb to heave derives from the Proto-Germanic hafian and entails the sense of lifting up or raising. It is closely related to a more common verb, to have. So to heave and to have derive from the same root, to take hold of, to possess. But in upheavals, the taking hold slips away from the grasp and control of those who experience extreme events. It is not we who take hold of these tendencies that are underway. Rather, these tendencies grip us, throwing us along with our world up in the air. we are deprived of the support we usually seek from the more or less stable foundations of our existence in the social and cultural meshwork of customs, in habitual relation to our natural environment, in the daily routine of work or leisure. The dynamics of upheaval are close to elemental forces, especially those related to the element of the earth, with its seismic activity entirely uncontrollable and only barely predictable. As in the churning up of the earth, what is lifted in upheaval is what was already there as the underside of the present, secret, invisible, obscure, abstruse. With the shadowy underside of existence, of our own existential, social, economic, political, or ecological being emerging in the daylight of the present, a certain version of the apocalypse, which implies the ultimate uncovering or unveiling of reality, becomes concrete. That said, apocalyptic upheavals are not just drawing the curtain that has prevented us from seeing the true nature of reality. They meddle with a system of coordinates for meaningful experience, upending things, throwing what was down up and bringing what was up down. More radical yet than a revolution, a persistent upheaval invalidates our tried and tested methods for orienting ourselves in space, in time, and in the pluriverse of sense. I've in fact dealt with this totally disorienting aspect of upheaval in my books Dump Philosophy, A Phenomenology of Devastation, as well as in Pyropolitics in the World Ablaze. Not by chance, upheaval is a kindred word of the German Aufhebung, which it translates into English with much more precision than sublation, reversal, removal, or revocation. This word, this concept, is one of the keys to Hegel's dialectics, where it plays the role of the engine for the development of the most disparate of entities, from plants to the institutions of the state, from human consciousness to artworks, from logical categories to organic systems. While Aufhebung concentrates in itself the labor of the negative, that is, of negating the preceding state of whatever or whoever undergoes it, it is indispensable to the positive development of the entity in question. The same goes for upheaval, which besides the destructive or disorienting connotations it contains, renders possible what was impossible before. More precisely, upheaval allows for the disclosure of the murky underside, silently subtending things within their visible outlines, not to mention the switch of positions that sets an otherwise static order in motion. Perhaps we should say with Hegel that everything and everyone develops by upheaval, not thanks to the comfort of an undisturbed self-identity, but thanks to the splitting of this identity open, its churning and reversal, the uplifting of what was suppressed or repressed. Upheaval affects four broad areas of human activity: politics, culture, intellectual life, and technology. And this means that in order to interpret the changing world of the present, we need to interpret the world of upheavals and in upheaval. Yet, as I've already mentioned, upheavals are also accompanied by an implosion. And I think that the war that Russia is now waging in Ukraine is a sign of such an implosion of history itself. In the run-up to the invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, many international commentators considered the unrest engulfing Belarus, Eastern Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Kyrgyzstan as nothing more than challenges to Russia's, and personally to Vladimir Putin's, sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space. So in 2020, Financial Times declares Russia's neighborhood to be in flames. In the same year, Bloomberg News noted that, quote, it's harder and harder for Vladimir Putin to call the shots in Russia's near abroad. The New York Times proclaimed that, quote, Putin, long the sower of instability, is now surrounded by it. What these and many other related analyses had in common was their historical short-sightedness, which has come to dominate our epoch of clickbait news, sound bites, and on-demand mass production of opinions. It was and still is simply assumed that the collapse of the USSR is an event that happened in the past, a roughly 3-year process of dissolution that culminated in replacing the Soviet red flag with the Russian tricolor over the Kremlin on December 25th, 1991. But are things as simple as that? To put the war in Ukraine and strife in which some of the former Soviet republics are engulfed in its proper context, we need to develop a robust philosophy of history, above all of political history. I do not mean that what is necessary is a hair-splitting production of academic articles and books, reveling in jargon that remains inaccessible to the common folk. Instead, at the level of our public consciousness, we need to imagine political history otherwise, with all its gaps, protracted subterranean processes, and time lags between causes and effects. There is a well-known anecdote about the conversation that the US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger had with Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai in the early 1970s. When asked what he thought of the French Revolution of 1789, the Chinese statesman replied, "It's too early to tell." In an attempt to explain away this puzzling response to an event that had taken place nearly 200 years prior to the conversation, it was said that in a translation glitch, Zhou Enlai thought that he was being asked about the 1968 student uprisings in Paris. To Western commentators, it was simply inconceivable that something that had happened so long ago was still not open to historical judgment and could still have an indeterminate future. But even if some sort of confusion between French events in the 18th and the 20th centuries took place, it was wholly justified. Were not the uprisings of 1968 the afterglows of the French Revolution, alongside the Russian, the Chinese, the Cuban, and other similar revolutions? And so to us, living a little more than 30 years after the official collapse of the Soviet Union, it should be obvious that it is still too early to tell what this event has meant and whether it has even been completed. In the East and in the West, our lives are invisibly molded by its aftermath, as though our recent histories are a comet tail of that momentous occurrence. The ongoing dismantlement of the welfare state in Canada, the US, and Europe is largely explicable with respect to the disappearance of the Soviet adversary and the related global ideological struggle, which required a quasi-socialist placating of workers in the West. The assertion of a hegemonic world superpower by the US, reflected in Francis Fukuyama's narrative of the neoliberal end of history, was equally an outcome of that collapse, its consequences still far from exhausted. Within Russia itself, an intergenerational, cultural, and even communicational or linguistic gap marks a visible scar on the body politic. And of course, in addition to Ukraine, in Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Kyrgyzstan, various contestations of the status quo are synonymous with the non-resolved legacies of the USSR's decline. It is against this background that our relation to big historical events needs to be carefully recalibrated. Here, an analogy from astrophysics comes to mind. It takes solar energy traveling at the speed of light 8 minutes and 20 seconds to reach the Earth. Similarly, there is a delay between a significant historical or world historical event and its arrival, the full unfolding of its consequences. With reference to the breakdown of the Soviet Union, our existence is still happening in this delay, just like a ray of the sun that, having left the solar corona, has not yet hit the Earth. And this means two things. First, we know that we know that we can make sense of history only in retrospect. But the exact point in time when such making sense can happen with any degree of certainty is itself unclear. Unlike in astrophysics, where calculations allow us to predict when the energy released by the sun would make it to our planet, There is no such technique in the field of historical studies. Second, the indeterminacy of an event and of its many consequences implies that it is radically open, unstable even. It follows that still on its way, an event may come to the fullness of its accomplishment, or it can be counteracted and derailed. The collapse of the USSR may itself collapse, or be brought to its final completion. In this sense, possibility with its indeterminacy derives from a living past, not from the future. Putin's war in Ukraine is a ruthless and abrupt attempt to determine this indeterminacy. At the same time, the knots tied or untied in Putin's war in Ukraine are much more complex than the as yet indeterminate legacy of Soviet collapse. To European observers, the invasion of Ukraine is redolent of the actions of Nazi Germany in 1939. To the Ukrainians themselves, it invariably brings to mind the national catastrophes of the recent past, from the 1932-33 Holodomor to enormous population losses suffered in World War II and the nightmare of the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. To the Russians, the tightening of censorship and other internal repressive measures undertaken in the aftermath of the invasion awaken the memory of Stalinism. Whatever the perspective, an old, tired refrain, history repeats itself, seems to apply. I do not think, however, that history is merely repeating itself. Repetition entails cyclicality and definite temporal rhythms, not to mention the completion of whatever is being repeated. But many of the issues at play in Putin's war are precisely the trails of incomplete events, from the dissolution of the Soviet Union to the effects of radioactive fallout that take thousands of years to wear off. So what is happening if not a repetition of history? I would like to suggest that history implodes, tumbling into itself in a vortex of events that give off an appearance of repetition. One indication for the implosion of history is the convergence of different timelines in a single event of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The timeline of Soviet collapse 30 years ago, that of the Chernobyl disaster, which happened 36 years ago and points toward an indefinite future of environmental contamination, that of the two world wars, of the Ukrainian genocide, and Stalinist repressions of the 1930s. All this is concentrated and condensed in the current war, much as fissionable material is suddenly compressed into a smaller size and thus a greater density in an implosion-type atomic bomb. An explosion of hostilities is at its core a historical implosion. The three classical models that explain the movement of history have included the conservative fall, bemoaning the loss of past greatness, liberal progress, celebrating the opposite upward vector of ever-improving life conditions and ever-expanding markets, and cyclical repetition, sometimes combined with the first or the second model in a spiral of world destruction and rejuvenation by water or fire, as in Plato's Timaeus. Implosion is the fourth option that similarly borrows from physics to describe how history caves in and buckles, if not under the weight of its inner contradictions, then because of an amassing of unresolved legacies. In a sense, the fourth model combines elements from the other three, pitting conservative against liberal visions and exhibiting aspects of repetition due to the centripetal forces unleashed in an implosion, which is why we hear echoes of the restoration of the glorious past of the Russian Empire, of the irrepressible march toward market freedom and democracy in Ukraine, and last but not least, of the tirelessly repeated mantra, history repeats itself. The implosion of history is also palpable in the global environmental crisis, where the sixth mass extinction that is now underway is not merely a repetition of the previous 5 mass extinctions, but also a collapse of human species history, along with those of countless other species. In the geological epoch of the Anthropocene, this collapse is self-provoked as far as agriculture and the Industrial Revolution are concerned, and therefore bears all the marks of an implosion within the framework of the natural cultural history of Homo sapiens. The centrality of fossil fuels to environmental degradation and to the possibilities of funding Putin's regime holds a clue to their co-belonging within a paradigm of the implosion of history. Now, the perennial question of political action, what is to be done, cannot be raised seriously without at least a rough understanding of the historical context in which such an action hopes to be effective. Is the war in Ukraine a temporary setback on the road to freedom spreading around the world? Is it an equally temporary obstacle to the atavistic colonial restoration of Russia's imperial greatness? Does it repeat World War II in reverse, with the defenders of their homeland now in the position of occupiers? Or is something else afoot on Ukrainian soil in 2022? One characteristic of the implosion of history is that it draws everything and everyone into its vortex. If indeed the war in Ukraine is a telltale sign of this implosion, then we would be naive to think that though it is still early to talk about World War III, the hostilities taking place in Ukraine are limited to the territory on which they are unfolding. The imbrication of the nuclear issue in the conflict, including nuclear power plants and atomic weapons, is symptomatic of the temporally and spatially unlimited effects of these hostilities. Just as at the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic, which adds another brushstroke to the portrait of history's implosion, Europe and the United States considered the SARS-CoV-2 virus a regional health problem in China. So now the defensive position of the NATO bloc overlooks the transnational threats of nuclear fallouts or biological and chemical weapons, threats that crop up with greater and greater frequency in the war in Ukraine. The sooner the logic or the illogic of the implosion is grasped, the better we will be able to respond to the urgent question, what is to be done? After all, we are living not only at the end of an era with an acute sense of the end of history, but also, and more significantly, at the end of how we see history itself. Hence, my remarks on the philosophy of history for the present and of the present. Now, amidst the discussion of upheaval and implosion, I cannot avoid mentioning the genocidal thrust of the war in Ukraine. And in this part of my talk, I build upon my collaboration with the Ukrainian philosopher Anton Tarasyuk. Still before the news of summary murders of civilians in Bucha, Borodyanka, and other parts of Ukraine that have suffered under Russian occupation, the International Criminal Court had opened an investigation into alleged war crimes committed by the Russian military. While evidence is being collected on the ground, it is just as important to understand the ideology behind Putin's invasion of a neighboring country. It is this ideology that is responsible for the particularly cruel character of the actions of his military. Putin and many of his apologists are giving us what Slavoj Žižek called the broken kettle logic of the war in Iraq. Borrowing from Sigmund Freud's interpretation of an old joke about a broken kettle, Žižek uses the example to shed light on the unconscious defense mechanism, deploying many inconsistent arguments. First, I never borrowed the kettle from you. Second, I returned it to you unbroken. Third, the kettle was already broken when I got it from you. Obviously, the three of them cannot hold at the same time, and yet all three arguments are given as valid at the same time. And does the same mix of reasons not apply even more to the war that Russia is waging against Ukraine, as explained by the Russian leadership itself? So I never borrowed the kettle from you is tantamount to the denial of the very fact of there being a war, which is officially called a special military operation in the Russian media. I returned it to you unbroken corresponds to the rigged history lesson Putin gave to the public in announcing this very special operation, according to which he was going to protect the population of the Donbas region and join together, rather than break up, territories that have traditionally been part of Greater Russia. And the kettle was already broken when I got it from you, parallels the defensive stance, according to which Russia attacked its neighbor because it felt threatened either in the long term by the eastward expansion of NATO or in the short term due to the belligerent designs imputed to Ukraine. Thus, according to the official justifications of the unjustifiable war, it was simultaneously a preventive strike, a special operation to stop genocide, and a war of conquest and imperial expansion. Nevertheless, the brutality of Russian military activity on the ground in Ukraine paints a picture that is vastly different from the mess of the broken kettle. If alleged war crimes are so prevalent in the Russian invasion, that is because its aim is the genocide of the Ukrainian people. In the beginning of April, one of Russian political technologists loyal to Putin, Timofey Sergeytsev, published a manifesto in the official state-owned RIA Novosti agency, according to which Ukraine should cease to exist as an independent country after the special military operation is over. Nothing escapes the destructive intent of this creed. Ukraine would be stripped of its territorial integrity, of cultural identity, and of its very name. While the Western regions, the Catholic provinces, as Sergeytsev calls them, of the country would be demilitarized and subject to a constant threat of war should they rebel, the rest of Ukraine would be subject to Russia's curatorial authority, including the state propaganda machine of the TV, schools, and public cult-like celebrations that has been so effective in subduing the population of Russia itself. Harsh repressive measures, up to and including mass executions, would be reserved for Ukrainian nationalists who refuse to obey Russian denazifying powers. Now, this chilling document lifts a curtain on what is perhaps the most coherent ideological backdrop for the atrocities committed by Putin's army on the Ukrainian soil. Why? First of all, genocidal wars do not flare up ex nihilo, or out of the vacuum. As I've already mentioned, nearly a century ago, in 1932-33, the Stalinist regime unleashed Holodomor, or artificially created famine, onto the Ukrainian population. Internationally recognized as a carefully planned genocide of the Ukrainian people, Holodomor is denied in Russia. An attempted genocide, unacknowledged as such by the perpetrator, festers like an open wound and is ever present in the shape of collective trauma. No healing is in fact possible without the acknowledgement of and the reparations for the enormous damage that has been caused, as in the case of Germany with regard to the Jewish populations subjected to Hitler's genocidal actions. In this sense, Putin's war in Ukraine is a continuation of this tragic chapter in the histories of the two nations. Second, the accusation of genocide leveled by Putin against the Ukrainian state and its actions in the Donbas region are indicative of Russia's own intent. Just as Russia's use and enabling of use of chemical weapons are often preceded by allegations that the victims are planning to resort to such weapons, so a genocidal scheme is betrayed by the imputation of genocide precisely to those against whom such a scheme is to be unleashed. The psychological mechanism of projection, in which people attribute to external others what is in their own minds, may account for this otherwise puzzling behavior. Third, and equally importantly, genocides are not only mass killings, but also ideological designs to exterminate a culture, a language, an identity. All these elements are present in Sergeytsev's manifesto, making it so disturbing. At the same time, though, it would be misguided to read it as a classical official declaration of intent, reviewed and approved by people in power, to be published as a demonstration of what Russia stands for. And unfortunately, not because the document does not fulfill its function. On the contrary, the RIA platform where it was published says it all, in conjunction with the behavior of the Russian army in Ukraine. The problem with this document is a deeper one and a more illustrative one as well. Russian ideology is supported and conditioned by a complex apparatus used as a vehicle for its reproduction and spreading. This apparatus combines a broad spectrum of agents and dissemination points, from a TV host who simply broadcasts a Russian patriotic news interpretation, to secret troll factories, paid pundits, and networks of proxy telegram channels camouflaged as independent or Ukrainian information sources. The Russian ideological apparatus has its own rules of the game. Regime strategists know them well. With respect to decision making, these rules are rooted in a constant process of second guessing and narrativizing the actions of the bosses, up to the ultimate boss, Vladimir Putin. There is no think tank, no philosophical mastermind, no matter how much Western academics and commentators want to name one, whether it be our contemporary Alexander Dugin or the long gone Ivan Ilyin, and not the slightest resemblance to any kind of center or centers for generating these sinister ideas. Actually, one cannot even call them ideas because they are pop-up constructs used as a smokescreen for the justification of political and military moves. To sum up the situation, we can use the body metaphor. There is no head in the Russian ideological apparatus. It is acephalic. The acephalic nature of Russian ideology creates a situation where there are no real authors and no genuine ideas, but there still exists a logic or even a methodology that accompanies and covers the decision making. And here we can come back to Sergeytsev and his own intellectual background. The word methodology is particularly instructive in this respect. It is not accidental. Sergeytsev is a product and a member of the so-called methodological movement founded by Soviet philosopher Georgy Shchedrovitsky. Shchedrovitsky developed and propagated a variation of the hyper-constructivist technocratic worldview grounded in belief in the unlimited possibilities of engineering design applied to the body politic. According to the methodologues, any kind of world rearrangement is possible, national, cultural, and social included, because ultimately there is no reality to acknowledge and reckon with. From its start in the late Soviet era, the methodological movement was not intended to be purely theoretical. Shchedrovitsky made it clear that the social goal of the methodologues was to approach decision-making positions as close as possible. And demand for their services rose. Russian elites, not versed in theory, needed smart words to explain their actions even to themselves. Many among Putin's media managers, political consultants, bureaucrats, and politicians are in one way or another affected by Shchedrovitsky's worldview. And even if they are not, the majority of them, of course, are not directly affected, some kind of similar engineering logic culminating in the idea that any deed can be methodologized and through this process rationally justified serves as their only ideological framework. The result is that for any of Putin's actions and for any action of the Russian army, people like Sergeytsev show up with arguments. And then, creating a kind of positive feedback loop, the regime mobilizes these arguments in planning new actions. It would be unfair to blame Shchedrovitsky's teachings for anything related to the war initiated by Russia, nor for anything written by Sergeytsev. But it is crucial to understand the nihilistic impulse shared by Shchedrovitsky's doctrine and the practices of Russian elites who are now becoming war criminals. From this nihilistic impulse comes the idea that the project of destroying a sovereign nation and its people is justifiable and can be seen as nothing more than a matter of creating a proper methodology with an action plan. It is this nihilistic impulse that, contributing to the implosion of history and unaffected by any value restrictions, creates a genocidal logic executed by Putin in the current war. I thank you for your attention and look forward to the discussion.